The inventory manifest was wrong. Overseer Velkareth noticed it first, not through any grand revelation, but through a single line of cargo data that refused to reconcile with the docking registry. 17 human vessels had arrived at Concord Station. 17 had been logged, scanned, cataloged, and disarmed under the terms of the Corval Accords. But the total displacement tonnage recorded by the station's mass sensors was 18% higher than the combined weight of 17 vessels should have produced. Velkareth flagged it as sensor drift, recalibrated, ran the calculation again. Still 18%. He closed the report and told himself it was instrumentation error. The humans had complied with everything. They had handed over every Dreadnought exactly as the Council demanded. There was no reason for the numbers to be wrong. There was no reason at all. He would not think about those numbers again for 11 months. When he finally did, he would not sleep for 6 days afterward. The Corval Accords were, depending on who you asked, either the greatest diplomatic achievement in Concord history or the most elegant act of institutional cowardice ever recorded. The Council preferred the former framing. Most of the species who had watched the negotiations from the gallery preferred the latter, though they said so only in private, and only after checking that no Council relay drones were within receiver range. The circumstances were simple on the surface. Humanity had been in open conflict with the Drath sovereignty for 19 months. The Drath, a civilization 1100 years senior to humanity's first interstellar contact, had moved into the Cygnus Reach in what they described as a territorial clarification. The kind of language that, in Concord diplomatic tradition, meant exactly what it sounded like while pretending to mean something far more moderate. Humans had responded by doing something no species in recorded Concord history had ever done in the first stage of a territorial dispute. They built warships faster than they were losing them. Not dramatically faster, not by some miraculous leap in manufacturing capacity that suggested hidden technological reserves, just faster. Steadily, stubbornly, week after week, the replacement rate for destroyed vessels crept incrementally ahead of the casualty rate. The Drath had reported this to the Council, with what could only be described as professional unease. The Council had responded by demanding humanity stand down, disarm, and submit every military vessel above Class 4 displacement tonnage for Concord custody, pending arbitration. The Drath, they explained with full diplomatic gravity, had agreed to cease territorial expansion for the duration. Humanity's ambassador, a small, unremarkable-looking woman named Sona Reyes, had listened to the full Council decree without interrupting. When the chamber fell silent, and the ceremonial speaking light above the human delegation's podium activated, she stood for a long moment and said nothing. "Then you want the Dreadnoughts." "Every vessel above Class 4, Council Speaker Amrathvel confirmed. "Every one. This is not a negotiation, Ambassador. The Accords are a condition of continued Concord membership." Sona Reyes had looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. How long for arbitration? 18 months, possibly 24. Another silence, then she had nodded once slowly. "We'll comply." The Council had recorded this as a victory. 3 separate subcommittees had filed reports describing humanity's capitulation as evidence that, when confronted with unified institutional pressure, even aggressive species defaulted to rational self-interest. The reports were thorough, well-argued, and completely wrong. What none of the reports addressed, because none of the report authors had thought to ask, was why Sona Reyes had smiled just slightly as she turned away from the podium. Lieutenant Commander Hessa Doran heard about the Accords through official channels 14 hours after they were signed, while she was standing in the maintenance bay of the Ardent Shore with engine coolant on her boots, and the particular kind of exhaustion that only comes from 31 consecutive hours of emergency repair work. The crew chief, A broad-shouldered man named Pack, whose record showed 4 prior service commendations and 1 disciplinary note for calling a flag officer a bureaucratic tumor to his face, handed her the data tablet without comment. She read it once, handed it back. "Huh," she said. "That's it," Pack asked. "What would you like me to say, Chief?" "I'd like you to say what the rest of the crew is saying, which is that we just bent over and handed our fleet to the people who watched the draft take the Reach and called it a regional clarification." Hessa wiped coolant off her left boot with a rag that was already beyond saving. "The Council took the Dreadnoughts," she said. "They didn't take the Ardent Shore *." Pack stared at her. "Commander, we are a Class 3 patrol corvette. We carry 4 torpedo tubes and a point defense grid that the draft could peel open with a light cruiser. How exactly does that change anything?" She looked up at him then, and whatever was in her face made Pack go quiet. "It doesn't," she said. "That's the point." She went back to the engine coolant. Pack stood in the maintenance bay for another 10 seconds, looking at the back of her head, feeling the specific unsettling sensation of a person who suspects they are missing the most important part of a conversation. He just wouldn't know it for another 7 months. The fleet transfer happened over 9 days. Concord custody teams boarded, cataloged, and secured 241 human vessels. The process was orderly, professional, and entirely without incident, which itself made the custody officers uncomfortable in ways they struggled to articulate in their reports. They had expected not hostility exactly, but friction, reluctance. The small acts of institutional passive resistance that every species displayed when surrendering military hardware under political duress. Instead, the human crews had been cooperative to a degree that felt almost aggressive. Equipment was pre-inventoried. Maintenance logs were current, complete, and formatted to Concord specifications nobody had asked for. Every vessel had been fueled, serviced, and left in operational condition. "Why?" asked Senior Custody Officer Wren, midway through the 3rd day, to no one in particular. "Would you detail clean a ship you're being forced to hand over?" The human technician in earshot paused. She was a young woman, maybe 23, with the flat, calm expression that Wren had come to associate with humans who were choosing not to say what they were actually thinking. "We take care of our ships," she said. "Even ships you're losing." A half-second pause, "especially those." Wren filed this in her mental category of things that were culturally interesting and professionally irrelevant. Later, she would reassign it to a very different category. The arbitration process began, weeks passed, then months. The draft did not expand further into the Cygnus Reach, as agreed. They did, however, engage in what their ambassador called routine navigational exercises involving 37 warships within 6 light towers of the contested boundary, which was technically within their acknowledged space and technically not a violation of anything, and was also, to any observer with functioning threat assessment instincts, a very specific kind of message. The Council noted the exercises and described them in official communications as a navigational matter outside arbitration scope. In the corridors of Concord Station, in the break rooms and transit hubs and low-priority communication channels, where real institutional opinion actually lived, the phrase being used was considerably simpler. The Council had made humanity disarm, and then given the draft a free hand to position for the next move. Velcarath, now 6 months into the arbitration observation rotation, tried not to think about it in those terms. He had been a Concord administrator for 22 years. He believed in process. He believed that institutions existed to prevent the kind of catastrophic species-on-species violence that had defined the pre-Concord era, and that this belief required accepting that individual moments of apparent institutional failure were part of a functional long-term architecture. He believed all of this right up, until the afternoon he received a flagged data packet from the station's deep-range sensor array. The packet contained a single anomaly report, a Concord long-range probe. Deployed 14 months earlier on a standard survey route through the Hessian Drift, a region of low stellar density 3 sectors away from anything strategically relevant, had detected mass signatures. Large ones. Very large ones. Moving on a specific heading. Velkareth stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he pulled up the inventory from the Corval Accord transfer, the total displacement tonnage, the 241 vessels logged and catalogued. Then he pulled up that 18% discrepancy from 11 months ago, the one he had filed as sensor drift, and he sat very still for quite a long time. "Ambassador Reyes," he said to the empty room, because sometimes a person needs to say something out loud to make themselves believe it's real. "What did you actually give us?" He requested an urgent meeting with the council. This was, procedurally, a 48-hour process under normal circumstances. Velkareth filed an emergency escalation, which reduced the timeline to 18 hours. He spent those 18 hours pulling every piece of data he could find on human shipbuilding records for the past 3 years, and discovering, incrementally, with the specific dawning horror of a person who has been solving a puzzle incorrectly, and is only now seeing the real picture, that the numbers had never made sense. Not in the way he'd assumed. He had looked at human construction rates and concluded they were building faster than expected. What he had not done, what no one in the Council Analysis Division had done, was compare the construction inputs to the construction outputs. The humans had been consuming raw materials, manufacturing components, and drawing on fabrication infrastructure at a rate roughly 2.5 times what the delivered vessels represented. For 3 years. 2.5 times the inputs, the outputs everyone had seen and measured and catalogued and disarmed. The transfer had been real, 241 vessels, exactly as demanded. But somewhere in the numbers, there were the ghosts of 540 ships that did not exist in any registry, and the mass sensors in the Hessian Drift were telling him that something with the aggregate displacement of a small moon was moving toward the Cygnus Reach. The council chamber was colder than Velkareth remembered when he finally stood before it. Speaker Amrathvel looked at his data with the expression of someone who has just been told a familiar piece of ground has shifted. This could be a sensor malfunction, one of the council members suggested. 3 independent probe arrays, Velkareth said, cross-referenced. The signatures are consistent across all 3. What is the classification of the detected vessels? Velkareth looked at his data tablet. He had run the mass signature profiles against every vessel class in the Concord registry, against every known hull configuration in the Drath Sovereignty, against human records going back 40 years of observed construction. "They don't match anything," he said. "Not exactly. They're larger than anything human-built by a factor of approximately 8. The closest structural analog I can find is a human carrier platform design that was listed in our records as theoretical." Silence in the chamber. "Theoretical," Amrathvel repeated. "A design study, published 11 years ago in a human academic journal. It was assessed at the time as an engineering thought experiment. The conclusion of the assessment was that the resource requirement to actually build such vessels was beyond any realistic human economic capacity. And yet, Velkareth agreed. How many? He looked at the numbers one more time. He had checked them 4 times already. He checked them again. Based on the mass signature distribution, 41 distinct objects, at minimum. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. The kind that happens when a room full of experienced people simultaneously realize they have profoundly misunderstood something they thought they understood very well. "Contact Ambassador Reyes," Amrathvel said quietly. Sona Reyes appeared on the communication screen looking as though she had been awake for approximately 3 days and had decided this was an acceptable state of existence. There was a mug of something hot in her hand, and she was sitting in what appeared to be a relatively small utilitarian office, and the composed, slightly amused expression she was wearing made Velkareth feel, for reasons he couldn't immediately articulate, deeply unsettled. "Speaker Amrath Vel," she said, "Overseer Velkareth, this is an early call." "Ambassador," the speaker's voice was very careful, "we are detecting an anomalous fleet signature in the Hessian Drift moving toward the Cygnus boundary." "Are you?" "We have reason to believe the vessels may be of human origin." A pause, she took a sip from her mug. "What kind of vessels?" "That's what we're trying to establish," Velkareth said. "The mass profiles don't match any cataloged human design. Ambassador, when the Council requested every vessel above Class 4 displacement, you complied. You delivered 241 ships." "We did," she agreed. "Those vessels are currently in Concord custody." "They are." "Can you explain?" he said, and heard his own voice doing something slightly strange. "What is currently moving through the Hessian Drift?" Sona Reyes looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was entirely level. "You asked for every Dreadnought, Overseer, every military vessel above Class 4. We gave you all of them." A brief pause. "Those aren't Dreadnoughts." The speaker leaned forward. "Then what are they?" "They're construction platforms," she said. "Mobile manufacturing stations. Class 2 civilian infrastructure, technically. They don't carry weapons." Another pause. "They don't need to." The channel stayed open. Nobody in the council chamber said anything. The soft hum of the communication relay filled the silence. "Ambassador," Velkareth said slowly, "you've been building inside them." She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She just looked at him with that expression that he was beginning to understand was not amusement and never had been, and said, "The arbitration process is 18 months, possibly 24. You told us that yourself." She closed the channel. The first confirmed visual of the new vessels reached Concord Station 6 hours later via the probe array's long-range optical sensors. Velkareth was still in the operations room when the image resolved. He had not left. He had also not slept, but that was becoming something of a pattern. The hull configuration was unlike anything in recorded use. Massive, the sensor estimate had been 8 times standard human Dreadnought mass, and the visual confirmed it, except that 8 times felt insufficient now that there was an image. They were not shaped like warships. They were shaped like something that had never needed to look like a warship, because the concept of a warship as a design constraint had simply never applied. Pack's voice, when Hessa's channel connected from the * Ardent Shore, was very quiet. "I'm looking at the relay feed." "I know," she said. "Commander, those are ours." "Yes." A long pause. "How long has this been?" "Chief," her voice was steady, "you asked me 7 months ago how a Class 3 Corvette changes anything." She paused. "It doesn't. We weren't the blade. We were the distraction while someone else sharpened the blade, that's all." He stopped, started again. "Were you ordered to keep this quiet, or did you know the whole time?" "The second one. Some of us knew. Not because we were told, because we thought it through." A pause. "The council asked for what it could see. That's what they always do. That's what anyone does. You protect against the threat in front of you. What you don't protect against is the thing being built inside the shadow of the threat you're busy confiscating." Pack was quiet for a very long time. "We're corvettes," he finally said. "The 41 orbital platforms each carry between 12 and 20 fully assembled hull-class vessels," Hessa said, "plus manufacturing capacity still running, plus raw material reserves." She stopped. "We are also corvettes. Both of those things are true." The Drath Sovereignty's response to the emerging fleet signature was, in the official dispatches it sent to the Concord Council, characterized as a matter of significant navigational concern requiring clarification. This was the diplomatic equivalent of a scream. Vel'Kareth had spent enough time reading Drath diplomatic language to recognize the frequency. Their 37 warships, which had been conducting routine navigational exercises near the Cygnus boundary, began a slow, deliberate movement away from the boundary. The kind of movement that was too gradual to be called retreat, but was directionally unambiguous. The council convened an emergency session. Vel'Kareth attended as an observer, which was his role, except that he had stopped being only an observer somewhere around the moment. He'd stared at an 18% mass discrepancy and dismissed it as sensor drift. The question on the floor was how to respond to humanity's apparent violation of the spirit of the Corval Accords, given that there was increasing consensus that they had not technically violated the letter. "They complied completely," said Council Member Dathras, whose voice had the particular tight quality of someone working very hard to be fair. 241 vessels, exactly as demanded, every one above Class 4. The construction platforms are civilian infrastructure by every legal standard we have. They used the arbitration period to build a fleet we've never seen before, another member countered. "Yes, in civilian facilities with civilian classifications, using no military designation at any point. If we had asked for every vessel of any kind. We didn't ask for those because no species has ever used construction platforms as a military hedge. It's never been done." "Evidently," Dathras said carefully, "we should have considered it." The discussion continued. Vel'Kareth stopped listening to the specific words about halfway through and started listening to the tone instead. The tone was frightened, not of the ships, of what the ships meant. Because the ships, however unprecedented, were ultimately just hardware. What was underneath the hardware? The decision to comply in a way that was simultaneously absolute and completely insufficient. To hand over everything that was demanded and treat the demand as an engineering problem rather than a military defeat. To spend 18 months inside an act of political humiliation, quietly assembling a response that no one had thought to prohibit because no one had thought it was possible. That was not hardware. That was something else. Something that didn't have a category in conquered strategic analysis because you couldn't catalog it and you couldn't confiscate it, and you couldn't write an accord that addressed it. Vel'Kareth left the session early. He walked to the observation deck that looked out over the docking ring, where the 241 human dreadnoughts sat in their conquered custody berths, fully fueled and operational and waiting. And he thought about how the humans had cleaned those ships before handing them over. Every one. Especially the ones they were losing. He stood there for a long time, and the cold, particular feeling he had been carrying for 11 months finally completed its shape. They had never surrendered, not for a single moment. The whole process, the compliance, the cooperation, the ambassador's quiet nod, even the slight smile as she turned from the podium, none of it had been surrender. It had been a transaction. 241 ships in exchange for 18 months of unmonitored time and the Council's complete attention focused in exactly the wrong direction. And the humans had cleaned those ships so they'd be in perfect condition for exactly this moment, because they'd always expected to get them back. The Drath Sovereignty requested emergency arbitration with the conquered Council 4 days after the construction platform fleet fully emerged from the Hessian Drift on an unambiguous heading for the Cygnus boundary. The request was filed through proper channels, with full diplomatic protocol, with every procedural courtesy maintained. The Drath had, in 1100 years of interstellar civilization, never once requested emergency arbitration. They had called it, never requested it. Ambassador Sona Reyes was not invited to the initial session. She attended anyway, citing observer rights under Subclause 17 of the Concord Membership Charter, a clause that had been invoked exactly once in conquered history, and that most council members had not remembered existed. She sat in the observer gallery. She brought the mug. Vel-Karath, watching from the administrative corridor through the session feed, found himself thinking about Lieutenant Commander Doran's words, the distraction while someone else sharpened the blade, and realized he had the image backwards. The corvettes hadn't been the distraction. The dreadnoughts had been the distraction. 241 ships, the largest, most visible, most obviously military assets humanity possessed. Every council attention structure, every draft strategic calculation, every arbitration framework, every clause of the accords, all of it had been organized around those ships, around the thing you could see and measure and catalog and lock in a berth. While something else entirely was being built somewhere quiet, in the negative space of everyone's assumptions. He pulled up the original academic paper on construction platform military conversion, the one from 11 years ago, listed in Conquered Threat Assessments as a theoretical exercise. He read it now, properly, for the first time. The author's name was listed as S. Reyes. Sona Reyes had published the blueprint herself, 11 years ago, in an academic journal, openly, and every assessment that had reviewed it had concluded it was impractical and filed it away, because the resource requirements were impossibly large, and because no one had asked whether a species that had proven it would build warships faster than it was losing them might approach impossibly large resource requirements differently than other species would. He thought about the custody officer who had asked a young human technician why you would clean a ship you're being forced to hand over. Especially those. The Drath withdrew from the Cygnus Reach. The withdrawal was gradual and diplomatically framed as a voluntary repositioning in light of changing regional security dynamics, which was not accurate in any way, but was face-saving enough that the Council did not challenge the framing. Conquered arbitration formally closed with no binding determination, since the circumstance it had been convened to address had resolved itself. The human dreadnoughts were returned from conquered custody, in full operational condition. Pack received the news while running maintenance on the Ardent Shore S Point Defense Grid, which was where he spent a disproportionate amount of his time. He read the message, set down his tools, and stood up. Commander. Hessa was at the operations console, working through the routing calculations for their next scheduled patrol. She looked up. They're giving the fleet back, Pack said. I know. And the Council's not filing any sanctions. No formal violation cited, because technically there wasn't one. He paused. They just let it happen. The Conquered exists to prevent war, Hessa said. The situation resolved without war. From their perspective, it worked. From their perspective, Pack repeated, and from ours. Hessa was quiet for a moment. Outside the small viewport above the operations console, a section of deep space sat entirely unremarkable, the ordinary black of empty light years. We showed them that complying completely isn't the same as surrendering, she said. That there's a space between yes and no that most species never think to use. A pause. And we showed the Drath that the thing they were calculating against was never the thing they needed to be afraid of. What they needed to be afraid of was the fact that we were calculating at all, that we took a political loss and treated it as a design problem. Pack sat down heavily on a crate that wasn't entirely stable but held. That's a lot to communicate by handing over some ships and going quiet for 18 months. We didn't communicate it, Hessa said. We demonstrated it. There's a difference. Communication is something you can anticipate and prepare for. A demonstration you only understand after it's already happened. Vel-Karath submitted his administrative report on the Corval Accord sequence 63 days after the Drath withdrawal. It was the longest report he had ever written. He had also rewritten it 4 times, because the first 3 versions had felt like they were reaching for conclusions that were too large for the language he had available. The final version was much simpler. The report noted the original mass discrepancy, the sensor drift notation he had filed 11 months earlier, the academic paper, the construction platform classifications, the legal precision of the compliance. The fact that 241 ships had been cleaned to Concord specifications before transfer, and that this level of care was now, in retrospect, the single most important detail in the entire sequence. The detail that should have told him, had he known how to read it, that the humans had always intended to get those ships back, and had maintained them accordingly. The final section of the report contained a single paragraph that Velkareth spent 3 days writing, and almost cut entirely, before deciding that cutting it would be a form of dishonesty. Read, the Corval Accord succeeded by the Concord standard definitions. No military engagement occurred. The Drath sovereignty voluntarily repositioned. Human compliance was complete and verifiable. By every measurable metric, the process functioned as designed. It is the assessment of this office that the process functioned as designed because the human delegation correctly calculated that institutional compliance was a lower cost than armed resistance and a higher yield as a strategic move. They did not comply because they were defeated. They complied because compliance was the most effective weapon available to them at the time. The distinction is significant. The Council's design assumed that the demand for disarmament would function as a constraint on human capability. It would be more accurate to say it functioned as a direction for that capability to flow. This office does not currently have a recommended procedural response to that distinction. It is not clear that one exists. The report was filed, reviewed, and classified. In the observer gallery of the Council chamber, in a seat she had every procedural right to occupy, Sona Reyes had watched the Drath ambassador request emergency arbitration. She had watched the Council members recalibrate in real time. She had watched Velkareth's face through the administrative corridor feed without knowing she was being observed in return, and she had thought, with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite exhaustion, and was possibly some complicated compound of both, about the morning 18 months earlier when she had stood at the podium, and a room full of experienced administrators had watched her comply and thought they had won something. She had not smiled because she knew she was going to win. She had smiled because she recognized the moment, the shape of it, the way the Council had asked for every dreadnought with the complete confidence of people who believed that what they could see was the sum of what existed, and in doing so had revealed precisely the size and direction of the gap they were not looking at. You don't build a civilization that survives first contact, that rebuilds after 3 major colonial disasters, that replaces destroyed warships faster than they're destroyed, by being stronger than the things that come at you. You survive by being the kind of thing that looks at a political defeat, a forced disarmament, an 18-month institutional cage, and asks a different question than the one everyone expects. Not asterisk, how do we fight this? What does this allow? The construction platforms maintained their position at the Cygnus boundary. They were, by every Concord classification, civilian infrastructure. They were not subject to any arms treaty. They continued operating. Inside them, construction was ongoing. Velkareth knew, and the Council knew, and the Drath sovereignty certainly knew. There were no further demands. There would not be, because the demand structure that had produced the Corval Accords had been permanently altered by what the Corval Accords had actually accomplished, which was, depending again on who you asked, either the most complete demonstration of institutional naivety in Concord history, or the only response that made sense once you understood what you were actually dealing with. The Arden Shore ran its patrol route. PAC replaced the point defense emitter that had been causing calibration errors since the 3rd month of the conflict. He did it properly this time, with the right tools, in the right order, taking the full time the manual specified instead of the shortcuts he usually took when the maintenance queue was running long. He found himself thinking about what the commander had said, about compliance and surrender, about the thing that looks like defeat from the outside and is something else entirely when you know where the person's eyes are actually looking. He filed the maintenance log, every detail, current, complete, formatted correctly. Especially these. 41 construction platforms, 12 to 20 completed vessels each, plus ongoing capacity, plus reserve materials, plus the 241 dreadnoughts now returned from custody in full operational condition. A conquered strategic analyst, attempting to calculate the actual military capacity represented by this sequence, produced a figure that the council quietly suppressed, not because it was wrong, but because the number itself was not the disturbing part. The disturbing part was the methodology, the realization that the construction platforms had been under development for 11 years, that the academic paper had been published openly, that the resource investment had been running concurrently with the conflict, concurrently with the negotiations, concurrently with the transfer, that every piece of it had been visible in some form to anyone who knew to look at the right things in the right order, that the humans had not hidden the plan. They had simply placed it somewhere institutional attention didn't reach, named it something institutional attention didn't flag, and waited with the specific patience of people who had learned, over a very long time and through considerable loss, that the most effective place to build something is inside the assumption that it can't be built. The conquered had watched humanity for 40 years. They had catalogued, assessed, monitored, and occasionally arbitrated. They had built detailed models of human military capacity, economic output, diplomatic behavior, and strategic decision-making. The models were thorough and evidence-based and updated regularly. Every single model had made the same foundational assumption, that human behavior, like all rational species behavior, would eventually settle into a predictable pattern once the environmental pressures were sufficiently mapped. Velkareth sat with the suppressed report for a long time, alone in his office, and turned over the assumption in his mind. Looked at it from the angle of someone who had spent 11 months carrying an 18% mass discrepancy that he'd explained away because the explanation that fit the data required believing something that institutional experience had told him wasn't worth believing. The conquered was old. The oldest active civilizations in it predated human interstellar contact by thousands of years. In those years, they had encountered species that were physically superior, technologically advanced, philosophically complex, militarily overwhelming. They had encountered every configuration of capability that the galaxy had produced. What they had not encountered, what the models did not have a category for, was a species that responded to institutional defeat by treating the defeat as a specification document. Not asterisk, we lost this much, we have this much left, what can we still do? We lost this much, now we know exactly what they're watching, build inside the watching. He closed the report, put his hands flat on his desk. Outside the station viewport in the ordinary dark of space, there was nothing visible, nothing moving, nothing that would register on any sensor he had access to as a threat or a presence or even a notable object. He thought about what might be out there that he wasn't looking at because he didn't know to look. He thought about that for a very long time. The galaxy had never encountered anything quite like humanity, not because humans were the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced or the most ancient or the most powerful by any standard measure that the conquered had ever developed to compare civilizations against each other, but because humanity was, uniquely, specifically, and apparently irrevocably, the only species in recorded history that could take a complete and total institutional defeat, comply with every demand, smile at the podium, spend 18 months building something in the gap between what was asked and what was prohibited, and emerge from the other side with more than it had when the defeat began. Not asterisk still standing after everything tried to bring it down. Taller, and somewhere in the back of every calculation, every model, every updated threat assessment, every strategic projection the conquered would now and forever produce about humanity. There would need to be a variable that no one had a good name for yet. A variable for the specific and terrible possibility that whatever humanity appeared to have lost, and whatever they appeared to currently possess, were both almost certainly not the thing you actually needed to be watching. That the thing you needed to be watching was the question they were asking right now, in the negative space behind your attention, in the gap between your demand and your imagination.